So the question is, why does this recipe book lock onto the number 72? Like, why not like 5 demons or 1,000? Like, why that number? Well, the number 72 isn't random. Oftentimes in Jewish mysticism, it's associated with a set of hidden names of God. And this is very important. Later, occultists look at that number and they essentially build a shadow version of it, where some traditions imagine 72 names of God. Later, grimoires talk about 72 demons. Again, it is this kind of dark inversion. Instead of a full map of holy forces, you get a full roster of hostile evil ones. So when the Ars Goetia lays out exactly 72 spirits under Solomon's command, it's not just saying like, here's some demons, check it out. It's suggesting that Solomon sits at the center of this massive supernatural tapestry, like a filing system, a way to see the names and potentially command every different type of spirit that there is. And in that framing, it's not just information, it is a blueprint for control, which is why in a lot of modern, religious and even like fringe kind of occult conversations, the real question is, it's not like, oh, did Solomon exist? It's like, who has these secrets now? And this is what real occultists and, people in the modern day are really talking about. Now, the modern imagination, Solomon's name shows up not just in grimoires and, in the Quran and in the Bible. It comes up in arguments about Freemasonry and demonic control and even plans to rebuild the Third Temple in Jerusalem today. Historically, modern Freemasonry is, debated really when it starts, but typically it's attributed to like the 17th, 18th century as a, they would describe it like a moral philosophy and, a place for men to gather and fraternize. And it uses the building of Solomon's temple as a central allegory, Masonic rituals tracing all the way back to medieval stonemason guilds, symbolically placing members at the construction site of the first temple, and they stand alongside Solomon and King Hiram of Tyre and the legendary master builder known as Hiram Abiff. And the temple becomes a metaphor for building this inner temple of virtue in the soul, not a literal blueprint for physical building projects. At least that's how they would describe it. And oftentimes when people think like, oh, Masons, like Freemasons, like what these, oftentimes people understand this to meaning they're talking about Masons that actually built the temple, right? Like once you hear it, you're like, oh, that actually makes some sense. If you visit Grand Masonic headquarters like the Masonic Temple in Philly or other historic lodges, you'll find rooms designed to mimic or evoke King Solomon's temple, with pillars labeled Yakin and Boaz, checkerboard floors, and starry ceilings meant to represent the heavens. Masonic writers repeatedly stress that these are symbolic. They say it's a part of the drama about moral growth and craftsmanship and all that stuff, not instructions for rebuilding a temple or controlling demons or any of that stuff. At least that's what they say. Now, outside the lodge, especially in some Christian circles and Islamic circles and a lot of conspiratorial circles, the story often looks very differently. Critics sometimes argue that because Freemasonry uses Solomon's temple as a model, and because it speaks about the great architect of the universe, it must be a part of a hidden project to resurrect Solomon's temple physically, a third temple, as a part of this apocalyptic end times plan. Now, again, this is not my philosophy. This is what people have discussed specifically in these kinds of circles. And in this telling, Masonic reverence for the temple and the use of sort of Solomon's symbols, they get interpreted as evidence that Freemasons are working behind the scenes to, control politics and finance and global religion all under this Solomon-inspired blueprint. And then you add the grimoires to the mix. I mean, the picture gets crazier in conspiracy literature. Like the Lesser Key of Solomon deals with summoning and commanding demons, and some writers just kind of push the two streams together, and they claim that Freemasons are using Solomonic magic and their great architect is actually demonic power. Now, specifically, we talked about those pillars that are found in basically every Masonic lodge ever. They have these two pillars, Yakin and Boaz, and they literally come straight from the Bible or the Tanakh, specifically from 1 Kings chapter 7, where it says that there are two giant bronze pillars at the entrance of the temple. And Yakin means he will establish. Boaz means in him is strength. And they're not structural supports. They're just meant to symbolize the threshold of the sacred space. And Freemasons really jumped onto it. It says here that Freemasons basically use this symbolic system of craft like stonemasonry and moral lessons and this mythic idea of Solomon's temple that when you walk in, you're entering wisdom. And there's a duality where you have strength versus stability, action versus restraint, and that you don't become better by picking a side. You have to use both, and you have to, understand the balance of the universe. And another important element here is the moral architecture. Masons think that, life is like building a building or building a structure. You have Boaz, that is the power to act, and then you have Yakin, the ability to create something that lasts. And ideally, you need to use both. Now, if you go to ex-Masonic forums or anti-Freemasonry blogs, you're going to find accusations that the lodge is actually a cover for Solomonic enlightenment, and that its symbols hide pacts with fallen angels, or that its rituals echo the demon binding of the Goetia. Freemasons and scholars, for their part, push back, and they point out that the craft's rituals are just, biblical, moral, and symbolic, and that the grimoires, like the Lesser Key, come from separate occult traditions, and it has nothing to do with Freemasonry. But then there's still the concept of the Third Temple. Now, in some apocalyptic Christian and Jewish circles, rebuilding a Third Temple in Jerusalem is framed as a prophetic countdown clock. This is a trigger for the end times, the return of the Messiah or the rise of the Antichrist. And because that temple is imagined as a restoration of Solomon's original building, the actual place to house the presence of God, obviously, Solomonic imagery gets pulled directly into these debates. So from a journalistic perspective, it's important to say two things on this section. Yes, Solomon and his temple play a huge part in Freemason symbolism and in some apocalyptic religious movements. And yes, some critics really do connect that to end-time plots and demonic control, but those things are very big and cinematic and oftentimes are attributed to conspiracy, and they're largely theories. No one really knows. This is not necessarily my personal belief. This is just something that I think is interesting when looking at this entire topic. Now, if you want something that's actually documented, not just alleged, you have to look at who was actually copying these Solomonic texts line by line in the centuries before, forums or Reddit ever existed. Who are these people? Well, here's the part that people don't expect, that for a long stretch of history, it wasn't like witches or like weird outcasts that are like going through these, demon cookbooks. It was priests or nobles or scholars. So throughout medieval and Renaissance periods, manuscripts like the Key of Solomon and the related texts circled in Latin amongst the educated class. Copies showed up with careful, notes in the margin and ownership marks from clerics and corrections that only trained readers would ever bother making. These are people that understood biblical literature, that were, making their own little annotations. And for the people using them, they weren't like horror props or like weird things to freak out guests. They were, in their opinion, real experimental tools for gaining knowledge and protection and healing, or just getting an edge in this world. And the logic is pretty clear. If Solomon, a king clearly favored by God, could command spirits without losing his status as God's wisest king, then perhaps others could also follow this blueprint, right? It makes sense. I mean, if you wrapped, your rituals in, like psalms and invoked like the Trinity and called on angels to control the demons, maybe you could be like, oh, this is just like advanced piety and this isn't like black magic or anything like that. But the line between miracle and magic gets blurry in this type of practice. So officially, the Catholic Church condemns these rituals. Councils and bishops would issue bans and they would destroy these books. And, even Protestant preachers would call these like superstitious tools, and some grimoires were even just destroyed altogether. But on the ground, the demand never really went away. It just kind of got hidden. Confession manuals from the period include questions about summoning spirits because confessors knew people were doing it. The same institution that produced saintly miracle stories also had members quietly trying these demonic experiments like in their free time. So by the 19th century, when occult revival movements like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn were rediscovered and reworked this Solomonic kind of demon material, they were building on a very long history of practice. For them, the Lesser Key of Solomon wasn't just a curiosity. It once again was a lab manual for the soul and for bending reality, one that plenty of people took very seriously and were willing to test it on themselves. And once you realize how many different groups have actually tried to use this, you have monks to magicians to like modern conspiracy people, you kind of have to ask like, what's going on with Solomon in this book? Why are people still so fascinated by this? Now, Solomon wasn't chosen by accident, right? He's the perfect candidate for this type of mythology. First, he's got legendary wisdom. The Bible presents him as truly like the wisest king. So if he's using it, then perhaps he knows something that we don't know. And in that light, mastering spirits becomes more of an extension of God's insight into how the world works. And then, of course, you have the temple, the first temple in Jerusalem that was so magnificent by every account from the Bible to the Torah. And then you have people struggling to imagine that ordinary labor could build something so enormous, so perfect, and the decorations and the gold. I mean, it was difficult, I guess, for readers to look back and think like, could humans really do this? And the ring really pulls it all together, right? This magical lesser key, the seal, the signet, that basically is a concrete device that explains how a human king could command demons or jinn to kind of build this massive construction. It's depicted as a hexagram or a pentagram, and it becomes one of the most recognizable emblems in all of magical tradition, stamped into talismans and diagrams, and eventually onto the visual language of Western esotericism as a whole. And underneath all of this is Solomon's personal complexity. The Bible doesn't paint Solomon as spotless. It shows him as drifting into idolatry, compromising, and finally falling under judgment from God. A flawless saint commanding demons would feel a little strange, but a brilliant yet compromised king touched by both wisdom but also temptation feels more believable, I guess. From there, everything else, the grimoires, the Masonic symbolism, the conspiracies, it grows out of this single powerful idea that Solomon was the person who stood right on the line between heaven and earth, between our tangible reality that we're interacting with all day and the spiritual reality, the unseen, that many people believe is right there, right next to us. And he ultimately tried to rule them both. So for thousands of years, people have only told one of these two stories about Solomon, right? Either he was the wisest king who ever lived, the man who asked for understanding instead of riches. He built the temple so radiant, and it became the center of the world's holiest stories ever. And that's the version that I was told. Or you have the other side, and this is the side that goes around in occult circles, that this was a king who learned how to command what should have never been commanded. The man with a ring on his finger, a list of spirits in his hands, and this invisible force that could build the most majestic buildings that the ancient world had ever seen. Those two versions don't really sit comfortably together, because if the second story is true, then many people have pointed out, you have demons or jinn building this house of God. It feels like those two things are in contradiction, perhaps. And if that's the case, then the line between divine wisdom and forbidden knowledge might be thinner than people really feel comfortable with. And going back to Solomon in scripture and, magic manuals and Freemasonic rituals and conspiracy videos, the stories and the myths around him force us to kind of try to balance them out. If Solomon is the wisest king in the Bible, blessed by God, if he was able to be tempted and fall into the temptation that ultimately got him judgment from God, where exactly is the line? He's the wisest king of all, but yet falls into temptation. He's chosen by God, but also, according to these much later writings and these grimoires and these non-canonical texts, is commanding demons. What does that really make us feel about one of the fathers and the oldest people in all of the Abrahamic religions? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a brief occult deep dive onto King Solomon, specifically the idea that he was a wise king that was able to control the power of demons. Now, a couple things with this. First of all, I don't want to make, like I said this before, I don't want to make it seem like this is a mainstream philosophy. This typically comes from occult and grimoire circles, where people are trying to understand how this majestic building was built, and was it done with humans, and it kind of squares a lot of things together. And for the most part, mainstream Christianity and, mainstream Judaism, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't necessarily accept this as, broadly speaking, canon. It's not necessarily seen as fundamental dogma. Now, of course, in Islamic literature, in the Quran, there is an understanding that there is jinn that are being used. But again, the jinn don't have the same connotation. They don't have the same evil force. They're just spirits. So I think sometimes people try to do a few things. They try to conflate a bunch of stuff.